What horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
You have a vast influx of new immigrant groups, so that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900 the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. We have the rise of tenement housing, which is really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. And it's probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement, so it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seemed strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Riis.
Many of the tenements were life-threatening, literally. That is to say that the threat of disease, infectious bacterial diseases like dysentery, for example, was always there, and epidemics could spread rapidly. The high death rate, the high sickness rate. This was the reality for many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of New Yorkers in any given moment.
Ill-fed and ill-clothed, packed into buildings with few sinks or toilets, and sometimes with no plumbing at all. Tenement dwellers were prey to every kind of disease: diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, pneumonia. Worst of all was the disease called the White Plague, tuberculosis. Every year, 20,000 new cases were reported in the slums. Every year, 8,000 people died of the disease.
July and August spell death to the army of little ones, whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. Sleepless mothers walk the street in the gray of the early dawn, trying to stir a cooling breeze to fan the brow of the sick baby. There is no sadder sight than this patient devotion against fearfully hopeless odds. Little coffins are stacked mountains high on the decks of the Charity Commissioner's boat when it makes its semi-weekly trip to the city cemetery. Jacob Riis.
How the Other Half Lives awakened New Yorkers to the condition of the poor, as nothing else had. It was a new way of seeing the world, a modern way. And Riis used it not only to underscore his outrage, but to spur people to action. The slums were not inevitable, he insisted. They had been built by men and women could change them.
One of the things that Riis is trying to do in this book, I think, is to get away from some of the older Victorian notions of poverty. Why are some people poor? Why do some people live in such terrible conditions? And his answer is more along the lines of a modern sort of environmental view of poverty. What he's basically arguing is that if people are going to live in these terrible tenements, if people are going to be deprived of the basics of light and air, decency, we can't be surprised if these people become criminals or depraved or alcoholics or what have you. So that there's a way in which Riis is, I think, the opening shot, if you will, or you know, the first chapter in a Reformed tradition. Because it was a book that made a lot of people want to get involved in improving life in the city.